In the months after the fallout with my bad therapy experience, I was still trying to make sense of what had happened to me. I knew my therapist had been harmful, but I didn't yet have the language to fully articulate it. Information on harmful therapy experiences can be difficult to come by, and at the time, I felt isolated in what I had been through. As I scoured the internet trying to make sense of what had happened to me, I came across Daniel Mackler's work. His YouTube video, "When Therapists Are More Unwell Than Their Clients," immediately caught my attention. In that video, Mackler, a former psychotherapist, challenges the assumption that therapists are always emotionally well-adjusted or immune to the struggles that they help others navigate. He sheds light on the reality that many health professionals grapple with burnout, unresolved trauma, and personal blind spots that can seep into their work, and sometimes even in profoundly harmful ways. But beyond that, he exposes how, for some therapists, these struggles go beyond the ordinary and into more troubling territory, where ego, a need for control, and even narcissistic or predatory tendencies takes precedence over ethical care. A recurring and particularly damaging theme he identifies is the resistance some therapists have to being challenged, clinging to their authority even when their actions cause harm. That video, which I've linked in the show notes, articulates something that many survivors struggle to put into words, and it quickly became clear that I wasn't alone. Mackler's work is widely shared in therapy harm support rooms, with that particular video often circulated by other survivors. His insights validate what so many survivors of bad therapy have felt, but struggled to express. But Mackler's work goes beyond YouTube. He has written several books exploring the limitations of traditional therapy, the long-term effects of childhood trauma, and the path to deeper emotional healing outside of psychiatric models. His titles, like Toward Truth, A Psychological Guide to Enlightenment, and Breaking from Your Parents, reflect his unfiltered, often controversial approach to mental health, one that prioritizes personal autonomy and deep emotional introspection over conventional therapeutic frameworks. Beyond his writing and films, Mackler has lived his philosophy in unconventional ways. He gave up his career as a therapist over a decade ago, rejecting what he saw as a flawed and often harmful system. Instead, he embraced a minimalist lifestyle, traveling the world, playing music, and continuing his work as an independent thinker and filmmaker. His documentaries, including Take These Broken Wings, explore radical recovery from schizophrenia without medication, further challenging the mainstream psychiatric narratives. Of course, his willingness to push back against traditional mental health models has made him a polarizing figure. Some praise his insights while others criticize his black and white arguments, particularly his skepticism of psychiatric diagnoses and conventional therapy. His detractors argue that he sometimes oversimplifies complex issues, leaving out important nuance. But whether one agrees with him or not, there's no denying his impact. He has garnered a sort of cult following among therapy harm survivors, shedding light on an important conversation and giving voice and validation to those who've experienced harm in therapy. After I discovered his videos, I reached out to Daniel, and over the past year, we've had an ongoing dialogue about these critical issues. And so today, I'll be bringing you part of that conversation. I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. Today's interview will be a little bit different from our other episodes, and for the most part, I'm going to let Daniel's words stand alone. You'll probably agree with some things, but you might also disagree with others. But I hope at the very least you'll find what he says thought-provoking. I think there are good reasons why his ideas have resonated with so many survivors, and I'm grateful that he's willing to join us. While this episode isn't exactly a narrative like most of what we share, we are all shaped by where we come from. So I asked Daniel to look back and tell us a little bit about the environment he grew up in.
Well, some of the things that led me to first go to therapy myself, the first thing is the patriarch of my family, which is my mom's dad, was a psychologist and a psychotherapist himself. And he was a professor at Cornell, the Ivy League university. And he was a pervert. And he, throughout my whole childhood up into my 20s, was having an affair with one of his former psychotherapy clients. And that happened right out in the open. He was still married to my grandmother, and we'd go to visit them, visit on holidays, visit my grandparents, and his girlfriend would be around all the time. She'd have dinner with them. And I later heard the story that he was her couples therapist. He counseled her and her husband when they were going through marital problems. This woman was younger than my mother, and he counseled them to divorce. He kept seeing her in individual psychotherapy. And then he decided he didn't want to be a therapist anymore. He wanted to become a sculptor. So he would trade psychotherapy sessions for modeling sessions with her, and she became his model. And then eventually they ditched the psychotherapy altogether, and he just paid her for nude modeling. And it sounds crazy, but it was true. And her sculptures were all over their property. And I saw this as a kid. I was brought into this environment and didn't really know what it meant. All I knew is that it caused hell in my family. My mom would get drunk whenever she was around it, and she'd see this dynamic going on. And my father would try to kiss up to my grandfather, and no one ever said there was anything wrong with this, except all the signs were that it was wrong. And this was just a core rottenness in my family. They brought me to this horrible environment with my grandparents all the time, and it wasn't spoken of. And if anything, my mom was jealous of my grandfather's girlfriend because he paid a lot of attention to her. I also saw my grandmother getting drunk a lot because my grandmother was so miserable about it, but never stood up to him. And he'd had other affairs too, but this was his last one and his longest one. And it lasted for decades. And it really was a backdrop of my childhood. And then later, when I started putting the pieces together and I started talking about it openly, I had some desire to be honest about what I was seeing. I was shot down and shut down. And also, everybody blamed his girlfriend, who was the client. And I didn't really know any better because I was just a kid. But to take one quick step away, I had never been in therapy myself. But what happened to me is I had a father who was a rageaholic and could be violent, and was very jealous of me for my mother's attention. And sometimes he hit me and would really put me down. So I was very sort of locked up inside myself in a lot of ways. And I was also a very small boy. I grew quite late. But what happened to me is in 7th grade, I got beaten up by a girl who was a year older and much bigger than me. And she just singled me out, and she punched me in the stomach and knocked me on the ground, and everybody laughed. And had a really devastating effect on me, especially combined with my dad being abusive to me at home. And I started acting out. And I started acting out through teasing other kids. And I started fighting also. And I got caught for fighting with another boy who was small like me. And I got the blame pinned on me. In a way, it was correct because I was kind of being a bully. But I got sent to the school psychologist. And that was my first time going to a therapist myself. And she didn't ask me anything. She just said, "This is what you've done." And she was scowling at me. She clearly didn't like me. And she said, "You're going to be put in in-school suspension if you do any more of this stuff." And then she dismissed me. And there was never any question about why I was doing it. And I remember hating her, just despising her for doing that. And it was one therapy session I had, and I didn't want anybody to find out. It was incredibly humiliating. And that was my entire experience of going to therapy until I was 26. I went to therapy of my own volition when I was 26 at the recommendation of, it's embarrassing, but I was clueless, at the recommendation of my mother, who said, I think it could help you. And she was kind of pressuring me to do it and pressuring me to do it. And she said, there's a great therapist. He's come really highly recommended. He's a wonderful man. And I went to him, and part of me really liked him because he listened to me, and he was smart, and he was an older guy. He was in his 50s, and he had a nice, distinguished office in New York City. But there were signs something didn't feel right. One, he wouldn't tell me how much he was charging. He didn't tell me. And he said, don't worry. His quote, it'll be eminently fair. So I brought $100, which was a lot for me. This is half my life ago, actually, because I'm 52 now. So I brought $100, but no, don't worry. We'll work it out the next session. That was one. The other thing was he started the session like 15 minutes late. And then there was some young woman client who came out late and looked flustered. And I just thought, okay, no big deal. The next session, he was late again, 15 minutes. And he apologized for it, but still didn't tell me how much he was going to charge. Don't worry, it'll be eminently fair. This is not going to be an issue. And it was sort of uncomfortable to me, especially since he really seemed to like me. What he did, though, I told him what my goals were in therapy. I wanted to be a published writer, but I said, I'm kind of addicted to writing, and it's not helping me. I need to stop writing. I need to not worry about getting published, and I need to get actually a proper career and get away from this obsession. Well, the second session, he completely forgot what I said. And he said, I think it's wonderful that you want to be a writer. And that he said, I think I can refer you to someone who can help you get published. And I remember saying, that's not what I'm here for. I said the exact opposite. I need to stop it. It's kind of an obsession or an addiction for me. And and I confronted him on it. And he was very complimentary. Oh, it's so good that you stand up for yourself. You have excellent boundaries, and you have such a good outlook for your future with boundaries like that. And you're so well-spoken, et cetera, et cetera. But what happened was I felt uncomfortable with it. And I thought, he just so totally missed the boat on what I said I needed. I was having a problem wanting to be a writer in terms of needing to stop it. And here he was pushing it. So I thought, I think I don't want to work with him. And after confronting him, I saw the look on his face. He was a little bit scared, but he really was very complimentary of me. Well, the third session, I came in and he said, I have to admit to you, I can't work with you anymore. And I'd been thinking I was going to fire him, but he fired me. He said, the reason is, I'm not going to name who the person is, but he said, I am actually the psychotherapist for someone else in your family. And he named that person and then said, it's a conflict of interest. I can't work with you both. And so I want to refer you to a psychotherapist colleague of mine who also used to be a writer for the television show The Waltons. And I think he can really help you move forward with your writing career and do psychotherapy at the same time. And I remember just thinking, you asshole. I couldn't believe it. He missed the point again. And then I thought, also, I didn't know much about therapy really, but I thought, he just released the name of a confidential client of his who happened to be in my family. Wait a second, you're not supposed to tell who your clients are. And then he charged me, it was true, very little money. And I paid him in that session and I left. But I remember being disgusted by him and feeling ashamed of myself also. It was very confusing because part of me really had wanted me to like him because he seemed to be such a respectable, mature guy. But that was my first time. Then I went to therapy again. And what happened is I decided then, it sounds bizarre and ironic, but I wanted to become a therapist. And a big part of it was these terrible people. And I thought I could do better than that. And also I was in Al-Anon at the time, the 12-step program for families of alcoholics. And there were a lot of therapists in there. And I just thought, God, these people are really screwed up, a lot of them. But there were also a lot of people who spoke very highly of their therapists. And some of these people were my friends. And I thought, I think I might like to do that job. So that's what led me to become a therapist, wanting to do it and realizing I could certainly do better than all these creeps and losers who I knew who were therapists. I could be better than they were.
Daniel had studied biology in his undergrad, and he says that scientific outlook helped prepare him for the work of therapy. But it also made him skeptical of a lot of what he saw. Much of the psychological literature and theory he encountered didn't seem to be grounded in the kind of intellectual rigor he had expected. And that's part of why he focused on the realm of social work for grad school.
Well, what I found in general is my fellow social work students, they were mostly women. It was 90% women. And most of them were really kind people, open-hearted, kind people for the most part. There were a few oddballs and a few people who I felt were kind of power freak types. Most of them tended to be older, but for the most part in social work school, and not everyone was going to become a therapist. A lot of people just wanted to become social workers, but mostly they were kind souls. I didn't find the same with my professors, and also the same thing with my supervisors, because right away they threw me into being a therapist. And I found my professors, my supervisors, mostly to be power hungry types. They liked being in control. They liked the power in telling other people what to do, making decisions for other people's lives. I didn't really admire or respect any of them. I learned a lot from them. Actually, what I learned is, because I became a therapist when I was 27, I learned to be very careful what I shared about my clients with my supervisors, because I realized my supervisors, not only were they not really on my side, they weren't on the side of my clients. And so it was a real learning process to see that a lot of these clinician supervisors, they just were not good people. And I felt the best way I learned how to be a therapist, it came from primarily two ways. One was a lot of the reading that I did. I found some good authors. Most of the psychology writing I found was not good, but I found a few good authors who I liked, especially people who wrote about trauma. And the other one is just by being with my clients and sitting with people. It was a very demystifying process for me, because I had always thought therapy was the therapist had some guru sort of secret knowledge that you had to be a genius to get. And a lot of my professors put that idea out there, and a lot of the psychology books put it out there. I couldn't follow a lot of the psychology books. I didn't understand why the therapist said what they said. The supervisors made themselves out to be guru geniuses. What I found with my clients is just sitting, mostly listening and being a human, and also listening to the feedback of my clients and trying to find out what they actually wanted was very helpful. And listening to my clients, what do they like? What do they not like? What works? What doesn't work? Who wants me to talk? Who wants feedback? Who doesn't want feedback? And it sounds a little odd to say, but to drop a lot of my point of view on what I think is right, and instead to just follow them along on a listening journey. That's pretty much what I did for a long time. And that in and of itself was, I found, very difficult. It was actually led to a lot of very sad places in people's lives. But I also found it very fulfilling. And basically, I just felt the main thing was just respecting my clients and learning as much as I could. I took a lot of their recommendations on books to read. Those were the kind of books that I found interesting. Like, I started by working with Vietnam combat vets at a vet center in New York. And most of them were Vietnam vets. And they're like, you got to read this book. You've got to watch Apocalypse Now. You've got to watch this movie. You got to watch that movie. So a lot of my learning to be a therapist was just doing what they told me to do and listening. And what did surprise me is that a number of people who went through my social work program felt that that training was good enough to train them to become a therapist. I felt it wasn't good enough to do anything. It was sort of stupid. But sitting with clients, spending a lot of time sitting with clients, that was an education. Two other things specifically that really I felt helped me gain confidence in being a therapist. One was just my own personal life experience. One was the therapy I'd been to. Don't do what those people did. Don't do what my supervisors do. Don't be stubborn and pig-headed. Don't be a power freak, and follow people on a journey. It's not about always leading them. Just the practice of being out in the world, being with people, being respectful in an anonymous, confidential environment like hitchhiking that actually has a lot of stress in its own way was really a good preparation for me being a therapist, especially with people who are sometimes very angry, and realizing just because they're angry doesn't mean they're angry at me. And also that anger has a real place, because I had a lot of anger too.
Not long after he started working with clients, Daniel found a new therapist to meet with for himself. Things started well enough. but eventually she would confirm much of what he was already seeing throughout the mental health world.
First, I really liked her. She listened well. She was really smart. She seemed very compassionate, empathic, kind. But as I went deeper into my issues, I saw her twice a week, and I also lay on a couch. She sat behind me and took notes. And all went well until I started criticizing her. Started saying things like that I didn't agree with what she said. This is a long time ago now, but she would make comments sometimes. Sometimes I would agree with it, but if I didn't, I would say it. Especially since I was just becoming a therapist myself, I really felt like I had an inside scoop. Wait a second, I'm paying money for this. I have a right to speak my mind and let her deal with it. Let's have a proper exchange. It probably would have been a lot easier for the power dynamic between the two of us if I'd been facing her. I was sort of inherently disempowered by lying on a couch and her sitting behind me staring at the back of my head. But she was the one who suggested it, and I wanted to be kind of a good patient, and she really seemed to like me, and I got a certain sense of pride out of that, being her super smart, special client who she spoke very highly of. She called me a patient. Yet when I started confronting her about little things, she never was overtly defensive, but what I noticed is she started talking a lot less. And she stopped pretty much giving feedback, or when she would give it, I would notice anxiety in her tone. And I kept lying on the couch for, I don't know what it was, a year and a half, twice a week. But I just became like super attuned to the tone of her voice. I could hear when she was writing or not. I would sometimes ask her, "What are you writing?" It's almost cliche, but she would say things like, "What do you think I'm writing?" A lot of that kind of stuff. But she stopped giving her opinions on almost anything. And it became like a battle of wills. And I really sensed, and I believe that I'm correct, that she just didn't really have a grasp on who I was. The other thing is I'd been doing a massive amount of journaling for several years. What I didn't realize at the time was how much I'd really gotten to know myself and know my feelings and analyze myself and really have a grip on who I was. And she said things sometimes that contradicted the assessments I'd made about myself. And I started coming to this realization, hard to come to, but that I think she doesn't get me as well as I get myself. And then I started thinking, I think I get her better than she gets herself. And I would talk about that and she would just be silent. And I felt she was kind of mocking the idea, but not. It was not clear. I was displacing a lot of my feelings from my parents, wanting them to love me, wanting them to admit stuff, wanting them to be good parents. I was transferring a lot of that onto her and hoping that she would be a good parent and guide me and be wise toward me. And I'm going to use the word love, but love me properly in terms of nurture me properly. And the sad thing is the type of therapy we were in was really a setup for me to have those kind of feelings. That was appropriate. She even called it psychoanalytic psychotherapy. So when I had that transference onto her, I was doing exactly what I was supposed to do. The problem was she really wasn't equipped to help me understand what I was going through, much less be a mature guide. I think she just got threatened by it and a little bit overwhelmed and just pulled back. So when she pulled back, I felt very rejected. And in a way that replicated exactly what I'd gone through as a child with having parents who were very deficient, who couldn't handle confrontation. I confronted my grandfather even about having his girlfriend. He completely rejected me. He threw me out of his house. And everybody sided with him. I'd gone against the power figure in the family. And around that time, I started confronting my parents also. None of them rose to the occasion and said, you're actually right. Confronted my dad about hitting me and doing other things. And his response was, I never did that. I never did that. God damn you, you're selfish. That kind of thing. You always were selfish anyway, and you're lying. And so when that played out in the psychotherapy, it was very emotionally painful for me. It was a strong rejection, even an abandonment. And I talked about that in therapy, and she just was silent by and large. And it took me a long time, over a year, of this largely silent therapist who I was paying money to twice a week, for me to just say, I got to get out of here. But I felt so guilty and ashamed. How dare you think this about this person? because I still looked at her as a parental figure. She was older than me. She was ahead of me in the therapy field, but she didn't give me anything. It really hurt me. I really felt like there was something really wrong with me for a long time.
It was liberating for Daniel to realize he could choose to stop paying someone who actually wasn't really helping him. And that experience continued to inform the kind of therapist he wanted to be for his clients.
Well, I think the main thing is I never wanted to do that with clients. Don't be a fucking asshole, Daniel. Don't do that with people. Don't manipulate them. And what is the word they use now? Gaslight. It's a horrible thing to do that to somebody. And I know what it's like to be criticized by clients. I know what it's like to have flaws of mine pointed out. I know what it's like to have things that aren't flaws of mine pointed out. And the main thing for me was to honor the client, to realize they're in a less powerful position on an emotional level in the dynamic, even if early on, most of my clients were older than me. But to honor them, to listen to them, and to try as hard as I could to be emotionally secure, to listen to them. And what I did find is sometimes they were right. Sometimes, they pointed out things that I was doing or saying or things about my personality that were deficient in some way, not listening as well as I could have. But also, I didn't want to have people lie on the couch. I wanted to have them look me in the eye, look them in the eye. But I think the basic thing was just to try to be really respectful. I actually recently made a list of errors that I made as a therapist, and some of them are very painful. I had one early on where I told some things about a client. I won't give any details aside from just saying the client, a very tender human being who I was working with, who admitted that they had started drinking alcohol again. And I was working at a clinic and had a supervisor. I was an intern, and I told my supervisor, and she told me, you have to dismiss this client. That's against the rules of the clinic. This client who had this past substance abuse issues has to be 90 days sober. And I can't do that. That's a vicious thing to do, to drop someone just because they had a few drinks. She goes, you had to do it. And I had to do it. And the person felt really betrayed by me. And I hated myself for doing that. And how I modified my behavior is, guess who I'm never going to tell anything to again of any significance? The supervisor. I would see, especially working at clinics, I would get people's charts and see nasty things that therapists would write about clients. As soon as the client would start not getting along with the therapist anymore, the therapist a lot of times would take it out in the client's notes, which became part of their record. And so don't be vengeful. Also, I saw it sometimes when clients, there was a rupture and they quit the therapy on me, sometimes in that very session, that this even could be healing for people. They could fire someone. They could say, I don't want to work with you anymore. And in that moment, for me to be very respectful, to say, I honor your decision, and to not be vengeful and to not be nasty, because I've heard a lot of stories. I've heard a lot of stories from clients and friends of therapists saying, oh, you're going to fire me? Well, guess what? Now it's my chance to tell that you're this and you're this and you're immature and you hate women or you hate this or you hate that. To not do that, to not be someone who hurt a client in a last session because they were firing me. And I've probably been fired hundreds of times. And just to be respectful and let people go. But I would say, you're welcome to come back if you wish. And I had a lot of people who did come back, because that's the other thing. Sometimes things can get overwhelming. The intimacy can be overwhelming, especially if people have gone through a lot of abandonment related to their primary parental figures in their life who were loving and then abandoned them. I think sometimes people need to let out a lot of rage in intimate relationships. And I think therapy is a safe place to do that if you have a good therapist, someone who can handle that and is not going to turn it against you.
Daniel worked as a therapist for about 10 years, first in a clinic, then in private practice. After getting a front row seat to some of the ways therapy can go wildly wrong, he found his position to be very meaningful. It felt like a privilege to show up for his clients and actually try to meet them where they are. But he had a very large and intense caseload, and it was only a matter of time before he could not do it any longer.
I was really exhausted. I was very alone in the mental health field. I had very few colleagues that I liked or respected. Also, I was working with a lot of people who were called psychotic. A big part of it being when I was working at my last clinic, I got a reputation for being a therapist who could work with anybody. So I ended up seeing a lot of people who were not medicated, who were in psychotic states. And I got a reputation for someone who could just work with them. And a lot of these folks liked me. And then I got a number of referrals when I was in private practice. And it was just exhausting, absolutely exhausting. And what I found is pretty much in all of these people and in most of the clients I had, most of my job was just sitting and listening to trauma all day long and walking the road with people who were exhuming their trauma, following their pace, but finding that it was just a lot for me to handle. I wasn't charging a lot of money. Most of the clients that I saw was charging very low fees. And I was seeing 35 or 40 people a week. I just didn't have a sense of freedom. I started having a lot of fantasies about doing something completely different, going and trying different things. I remember going on vacation once and sitting on a beach where there was no cell phone reception. And all I could think about was, oh my God, which of these 3 clients who happens to be suicidal now might do something. I just was like, this is not working for me. The sad thing was, in spite of how difficult it was, I loved it. Just being with people all day and listening to them tell their stories. I found it fascinating. I also found it very self-esteem boosting for me because I got a lot of positive feedback from my clients about how useful they were finding it, especially from the clients who had experienced a lot of harm. Some harm from therapists, but a lot that I saw had been harmed by the psychiatric field, forced to be hospitalized, forced medicated, stuff like that. And so to be someone who they felt safe with, I recognized that, I think quite rightly, for the privilege that it was, but it was just a lot of responsibility and I think really too much for me, to be honest.
In the years since ending his practice, Daniel has focused on alternative, holistic methods of healing and on building a platform to share the things that he has learned.
When I was a therapist, I shared very little of my personal life, basically almost none of it. Now, as a public figure on YouTube, I share a ton of it and also share my opinions much more openly. And that's very stressful, but it's been a part of my healing journey to get out into the world, to be useful, but also just to keep on my own path of studying myself. But I'm not interested in therapy. I very rarely refer people to therapy. Sometimes I believe in the quality of a therapist. Sometimes I find there can be therapists out there who I trust. In certain times with certain people, I think they can be great, but as a whole, yuck for the psychotherapy field itself. So many therapists I've met, seen, and heard about are just so awful. But a main thing in my healing journey, studying myself, continuing to study my history, being open about it, getting away from my family of origin, who the healthier I got, the nastier they got, and also having a lot of fun. I found that that's been really important for me, to get out into the world, have a good time, enjoy myself, and in healthy ways. I love to travel. I love the freedom of getting out in the world, exploring the world, learning new languages, living with lots and lots of people and lots of different cultures. And what I find now is I have a lot of friends, women and men. And that I value, because the other thing is, certainly as a teenager into my 20s, back when I was looking for therapists to help me solve my issues, I didn't have very many friends. For a long time, I didn't have any really good friends at all. And now I do have friends, and a lot of the things that I used to think I needed from romance, from therapy, from my family of origin, those needs, the human interactive needs, the need especially for self-love, those needs are getting met elsewhere in healthier ways.
As he continued exploring and sharing his ideas, Daniel felt more and more convinced that the world of therapy can be a minefield of harm, with so many different ways of failing the people it claims to help.
Yeah, and there's also so many other things that I can say. It's a big topic, and it's one that I've thought about a lot, a different conversation, but I was going to bed the other night, and I was making a list of the number of therapists I could think of who I've personally met, who I would say, again, forget the labels, but let's just say you agreed with the label of sociopath, the number of therapists I've met who could be called sociopaths. I finally fell asleep. I didn't even finish the list. It was just like, it's just crazy how the mental health field can attract a lot of really disturbed people. I would just call them very insecure power freaks who really get off on the power dynamic, being more powerful than their clients. The analogy that I use is it's like artists, painters. It's like a very, very small percentage have a real gift for it and are really good. And 1%, maybe 2%. And then the far majority are just kind of average. They're not particularly good. Given a certain person, they could be really, really harmful. With others, they might just be sort of bland and average. And maybe that's 60, 70%. The other 30% are just absolutely horrible. What draws people to be therapists in the first place? It could be a lot of things, but I think a lot of people are just drawn by the power. It's a role that's very esteemed in society, and you get a lot of power from it. You get the power to be one who's knowledgeable about what is right about what's going on in someone's head and life. And for people who are kind of insecure and don't have a very healthy life or don't have a lot of personal connections, to have hour after hour people come in and sit down and treat you like you're knowledgeable, you're powerful, you're mature, you're someone who I'm going to ask questions and you're going to help me change my life and I'm going to give you money for it. I think it's just intoxicating for a certain number of people. And it's a real pull. And as long as they can figure out how to do a certain few things, a lot of times they can just get away with it and build a whole career out of doing this, whereas they have no business whatsoever in that job.
One of the areas where Daniel gets most passionate and where some might see his thinking as black and white is in the rush to diagnose. The ways that slapping a label on someone often prevents seeing them as a real and complex human being. This is a part of where he gets pushback sometimes. He's skeptical of diagnoses as a whole, particularly a diagnosis like borderline, and he thinks the language of disorders is harmful. Some of that pushback makes sense. It's true that a thoughtful, carefully considered diagnosis can be helpful for some people. It can offer a sense of clarity, a sense that what you're experiencing is quantifiable and there's a way forward. But it's worth hearing Daniel out, because he's right that in far too many cases, a diagnosis is wielded quite carelessly, or even used as a bludgeon against the client. And a checklist from the DSM should never be more important than the living, breathing person who is seeking help, who needs someone to listen to them and pay attention to what they're actually going through.
What I found in my experience as a therapy client is I didn't have therapists who really did that. Or even if they, on the surface, said they were trying to do that, I never had anyone who was any good at it. Having now known a ton of therapists over the past 25 or so years, I don't have a very high regard for the quality of the psychotherapists in the field, regardless of their degrees and their training and all that. It's just most of them I don't feel are very good at it. I read it somewhere, and I believe it to be true. When someone diagnoses someone, generally a woman, with borderline personality disorder, the clinician is saying, I hate you, I don't relate to you, I don't like you. You make me uncomfortable. So I never diagnosed anyone with any personality disorder, even if they technically could have qualified for it. I mostly diagnosed everyone with post-traumatic stress disorder because everybody qualified for it. Pretty much everybody who could have been diagnosed with psychosis also qualified for PTSD. The only thing was, as time went on, I didn't like any of the diagnoses, including PTSD. I didn't believe in the diagnostic system. I didn't find it helpful for me or my clients. People have a lot of stress resulting from trauma that they went through. Pretty much behind all emotional problems that people have, mental problems, or whatever you want to call it. What I learned is, by definition, post-traumatic stress disorder means the reason it's a disorder is that the person is experiencing a reaction to trauma that is beyond what would be expected in a healthy person who experienced that same trauma. That's why they have a disorder. That's why it's a mental illness. And I don't see having a response to trauma as being disordered or mentally ill in any way. And I find it kind of offensive to call it a mental illness. I think instead, by really listening to people, really getting a whole picture of their story, the responses that people have to what they've been through make sense. And the more I listen, the more it makes sense. So what I started doing, and definitely now my outlook on life, is just to assume that if someone's having emotional problems or emotional stresses or whatever it is, that there's a very good reason they're feeling that way.
Again, some of our listeners might disagree with parts of Daniel's ideas, but Daniel has a point that the language of illness and disorder can be used to dehumanize people, and that diagnoses can be weaponized against clients just as easily as they can be a tool for healing. And I think this is especially true when survivors of therapy harm try to speak up about their experience and pursue accountability.
It's not rare at all. Also, though, therapists tend to close ranks. When a therapist has someone go at them and confront them or, heaven forbid, report them, it terrifies other therapists. This is part of my evidence that most therapists are actually pretty similar. The really bad ones and the ones that are called really good, why do they all take the same side? I'm next is, I think, the fear. So they join forces with the last therapist, give the person the same diagnosis that the last one did out of anger or defensiveness. And very rarely will therapists come to the defense of the client against another therapist. They're scared. If someone wants to report a therapist, there's certain things that you need to do. I think it's just inherently such a flawed field. There's so many gut basic root flaws that how do you change that? Let's just start by scrapping the diagnosis and the DSM entirely. But the problem is, even if you do that, you still got these troubled people who have a lot of power and have a lot of arrogance and can do a massive amount of harm, whether there's a DSM or not. And what I see is a huge number of very troubled people who aren't looking at their core issues are in the positions of the modern priests and gurus, and they're called therapists and psychiatrists. Then nothing's going to change it. And they're more similar to each other than they're not. So they're going to close ranks. The other thing is, when you went and told your story of therapy harm to the next therapist, to the next supervisor, to the next therapist, and they all ended up blocking you and closing ranks with each other, probably really what was going on is you were pointing out exactly what they'd done with other clients, and it terrified them because they'd already done it. It's basically the idea of someone gets sexually molested by a priest. And the person who gets molested goes to the next priest and says, oh my God, this priest molested me, and I want the church to take responsibility for this. But the next priest they went to is also molesting people. So he's like, I'm not going to defend you. Oh, they'll listen. They'll be really kind. I know exactly what you're going through, but better to just let it go, move on. You have to forgive. Jesus says forgive, blah, 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 blah. It's not easy to speak against one's profession. And I wasn't a perfect therapist. I made my mistakes too. And I feel like I improved a hell of a lot. And you did ask earlier a question about training. And I feel like training is one of the worst things that therapists go through. It definitely, in most cases, makes them much worse. And some people have a much more of a natural gift. And the training itself can just kill a natural gift. I felt my training made me worse. And that took me a while to actually undo my training and go back to just what my natural gift was. I think a really good parallel, I've worked with a lot of people who are called severely mentally ill and helping them get out of psychiatric hospitals and helping them get out of psychiatry. And it's a lot of the same principles apply very directly if you're going to report a therapist. And number one is don't get angry. You have to have enough self-control to not get angry, because anger is something that the mental health field turns against clients immediately. Anger, you become wrong, you become vulnerable. It's the easiest way to pathologize someone if you get angry. Crying also is another one. And it's so sad because it goes exactly against what people need, the feelings that people need to have to heal. So if people think they're going to get healing out of reporting a therapist, good luck. They're usually not. They can say anger is a symptom of pathology. Anger is a symptom of all sorts of different diagnoses. This person has intermittent explosive disorder. This person has borderline personality disorder. The other thing is they can just say this person is angry for no reason. This person is angry at me and I didn't do anything. This person is angry at their last therapist, and it's just a perception on the part of the client. So if a person really wants to report a therapist and make criticisms about a therapist, the only way to do it is to be very emotionally contained out of self-protection. Otherwise, those feelings will be turned around by the mental health field. It's the exact same thing with people trying to get out of psych hospitals. If you want to get out of a psych hospital, don't tell your psychiatrist he's a piece of shit. If you tell your psychiatrist he's a piece of shit, he's going to re-up you for another 30 days and make you pay for it. And you got to say, oh, thank you so much. You helped me so much. I'm feeling more stable, even if you're not feeling that way. And I've heard this so many times from people. That's the way to get out of the mental health system, is you have to say you're healthy. And so reporting therapists is even harder. It's really interesting. I'm going to give some little inside secrets, if that's okay. You can go on the New York State Office of the Professions, and if you do a little hunting on the New York State Office of the Professions, you can look up therapists and you can see what they've actually gotten in trouble for. They keep a list and they're public about it. You have to look under the profession of social work and you look under the profession of psychology. And you can see for years, for the last 20-something years, you can see every single therapist who actually not only has been reported, but the licensing board has punished them. And you can see what therapists get punished for. And none of it is because the client said they were a jerk. The client said they were inappropriate. You have to have text messages. You have to have emails. You have to have some sort of photographic proof. So there are a certain number of therapists that get in trouble for having inappropriate sexual relationships, romantic relationships with clients. And it's not just men. It's a lot of women too. There has to be proof. Proof that's beyond the client's word, because the client's word alone doesn't count for anything. That's just the number one thing to realize. I've had people tell me, I've heard it hundreds of times. They come and tell me this therapist did all these awful things to me. Here's a whole list of things they did to me. And when they tell me that, I'm like, I'm 100% sure you're right. Now, what kind of proof do you have beyond your word? Because unfortunately, when it gets to the higher ups, the word of the client doesn't count for anything. And that's the sad rule. And that just goes to show you the power dynamics right there. The therapist either has to have admitted it, they have to have written it in the notes, they have to not have taken any notes at all, or there has to be some sort of text message where the client says, you're so sexy. That's proof. But if they haven't done that, and if they've covered their bases, and most therapists are smart enough, they're manipulative and smart enough when they're doing their harm to cover their bases and to write notes. All they have to do is write down, the client, we had a good session today, but the client was expressing unresolved anger and hostility toward the therapist for no reason, and right away, the licensing board looks at this and says it's an unhinged borderline client. There's no way to prove what the client is saying. So most people basically, unfortunately, are not only wasting their time to try to report therapists, they're actually going to compound the harm done against them. The one good thing with it is they're going to learn some real lessons in this process, and hopefully it won't kill them along the way. If your therapist knew there was an investigation being conducted, that therapist was on pins and needles for months, maybe longer, terrified that they're going to get in trouble, all the worst fears. And for all you know, it changed the therapist, where they weren't going to do whatever they did with you again, even if they're blaming you and calling you crazy or whatever they do. And even if they're going to get away with it, you scared them. And that's the thing. Is that justice for you? Not really.
Daniel knows that plenty of people are going to continue seeking therapy. And despite all of his valid skepticism, it might even be helpful now and then. But he hopes to keep letting people know that there are other ways of finding healing. There are even ways of finding the attunement and care you need within yourself, not from some outside one-size-fits-all methodology.
I need people who relate to me, who see me, who hear me. If I don't have that, I find myself journaling like mad a lot, almost like I have to build that relationship with myself on paper. We do need each other. I think a lot of times in our crazy society where people don't get the needs met from each other, people try to get that from a therapist, and a lot of therapists capitalize on that, manipulate it for their own emotional and financial needs. Or parents aren't giving that to their children, so they send their child to a therapist. Fix my kid, I'll pay you big bucks to do that.
I want to sincerely thank my guest this week, Daniel Mackler, for his time and willingness to answer all of my questions over multiple interviews to make this happen. He rarely gives interviews, so I truly appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with him. I'd also like to thank our writer, Bo Denton, for his work behind the scenes, and our talented audio engineers at Peachtree Sound for making sure everything comes together seamlessly. And of course, thank you for listening. I appreciate your support, and I hope you found this episode insightful. If you did, please consider sharing it or leaving a review. It really helps. We look forward to you joining us next time.